It's Tuesday in Simpsonville, and it's going to be a beautiful day. It's bright and sunny out, and we're already in the upper 40s and headed quickly to the 50s and 60s. We might get into the low 60s today. You know, it's really interesting at Christmas time. We get appeals from every type of organization asking for funds, you know, whether it's the Olympics, whether it's Salvation Army, cancer, heart, lungs, MS, MD, all of those organizations are all looking for funds at Christmas time. And in chapter 16 of Luke, we find 4 very important lessons. Now, the primary lesson that Jesus had intended certainly was salvation and the consequences of not having salvation. But this is quite interesting. It may not be a parable, even though it's listed many times as a parable. Because one of the things that I've noticed in parables is they almost never name a name. That is, it just says a man or men or women or whatever. Very seldom does it really name a name of a person. But here we have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. One of the things that's very interesting about this is that Lazarus is named by name. Well, let's get into the parable and let's look at the 4 points that I'd like you to see today. Now, there was a rich man, and he habitually, that is regularly, dressed in purple, that is royalty and finery, fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus, who was laid at his gate and covered with sores, and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Beside, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now the poor man died, and he was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man, who also died, was buried. In Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away. Now, when we look at this story, we see the first point, which is benevolence. Here is a man that had lots of means. And here was a man that had to be aware of someone who was in need. And when we look at this story, we realize that God's not asking us to take care of all of the poor of the entire world. We can't. We don't have the resources to do that. But those that we're very aware of, those that are close to us, those that come to our attention, we ought to help those people. Benevolence is an important thing. And here at Christmas time, in verses 19 through 21, we're encouraged based on our abundance. Just the crumbs, just some that's really more than enough that's falling from our table, and we all have that. Those ought to be helping those that are around us, those that we're aware of. Now, I want to warn you that lots of organizations put more than 80% to fundraising. So be sure you check your organization out carefully. I always encourage people to give through their denomination, because through their denomination, most of it gets to the final cause. But check out your organizations. I think you'll find that Salvation Army is still a very legitimate organization, with most of their funds going directly to the cause. Goodwill, not so much so, and many of these others who have professional fundraising organizations, not so much. But take a look carefully at the organization or the person, and be sure that you're not casting pearls before swine. So it's very important that we understand the benevolence, especially here at Christmas time, and that we're good stewards of what God's given us, and that we make sure that we have taken care of those needs that we're aware of. And certainly missions, home missions, foreign missions, missionaries, and our own denominational causes are good causes. The second thing that I want you to notice in verses 22 through 25 is I want you to notice that here we have a case of things, good things, coming to not necessarily good people, and not such good things coming to not such bad people. For the rich man obviously oblivious to the needs of Lazarus laying at his gate, and the poor man Lazarus had more than his share of trouble with dogs licking his wounds. I want to remind you that the second point here is that we shouldn't be so caught up in thinking that people that have blessings here on earth are necessarily God's chosen, nor people that are going through tough times are necessarily God's damned. Certainly we need to be careful that we don't make a judgment based on material blessings, and that's certainly a good second lesson in here. Thirdly, we need to take a look at the contrast in verses 24 through 26 of what happened to these two men. For it tells us that the rich man wound up in Hades, in torment. Tremendous contrast between where the poor man, Lazarus, was, who was in Abraham's bosom, and it says he was being comforted there. Yes, it doesn't mean that just because we have an abundance here on earth that we're going to have a good life hereafter. Nor does it mean if we're having a hard life here that we won't be comforted in a place called heaven hereafter. The third point that I want you to notice is not only this contrast, but I want you to notice there are two definite places. And there's a warning here because it says, as you look at the verses, there is a chasm, a great gap, a great separation between the two places. And as Lazarus is in heaven, the poor man, but the rich man is begging that just a tip of the finger of Lazarus would go into water and onto his tongue. And then when that's not possible because of this great gulf between heaven and hell, there's the warning that the rich man then starts to realize about his friends and his relatives. And he says, I have 5 brothers. Send Lazarus to warn them. Send Lazarus to warn them. So we come to the fourth important point, which is salvation. There's coming a time when it'll be too late. When we can't warn others around us about the great chasm, the great gulf, the great separation between heaven and hell, and the fact that one is a place of torment, the other is a place of great joy. So here we see in these last closing verses that when he's begging for those to warn his brothers, it's very clear that Abraham says they did not listen to Moses and the prophets, and they'll not be persuaded. Now listen, even if somebody rises from the dead, there Abraham's pointing ahead to Jesus' resurrection from the death to prove that he was God in the flesh, has the power over death. And he says they didn't listen to Moses, they didn't listen to the prophets, and they're not going to listen even to Jesus, who lived, who died, and rose again. You see, Jesus does prove that he is God and that he has the power over death. But even that's not enough to convince some who have hardened their hearts against the things of God. Well, 4 great points here in this particular passage of Scripture. And I hope that you'll really think about those today, because that's your thought for the day. God bless you and have a wonderful day.